The shadow of an eccentric person. Maggie had been staying at her friend's apartment in this remote town for the past few weeks. The old apartment was the perfect escape for her from the chaos of life, but the peace she sought was quickly overshadowed by an odd, unsettling feeling that seemed to linger in the walls. Lily moved around the living room, tidying up a bit. She noticed there were quite a few mirrors hanging on the walls, as her friend was a collector of mirrors. But those mirrors gave her an inescapable feeling that they held something more. As she passed by one of the mirrors, for a brief moment, she felt as though something or someone was staring at her. She wasn't sure and brushed it off. Maybe it was just her imagination. She picked up a few scattered items from the coffee table and walked down the hallway to the bathroom. That night, Lily prepared to take a bath. She was tired and wanted to relax, to forget the strange feeling creeping into her thoughts. She turned on the faucet to fill the bathtub, steam filling the room, but as she was waiting for the tub to fill, her eyes suddenly caught sight of the mirror above the sink. She felt as if something was moving. Maggie startled, turning around, but there was no one in the room. The air was heavy with silence. A shiver ran down her spine, and she quickly exited the bathroom, her thoughts spinning. She tried to convince herself that it was nothing, just stress from being alone in a strange place. One night, as she was about to drift off to sleep, she noticed a noise, or something moving. A shadow was cast on the floor. She felt an unease unlike anything she'd ever experienced. She didn't dare move. Her anxiety grew. Suddenly, the feeling of being watched became unbearable. Maggie turned, opened her eyes, and there he was, a tall, pale, gaunt man with sunken eyes standing right behind her. Maggie jumped up, rushed to turn on the bedside lamp, but her hand slipped, and she knocked it over. As the lights flickered, the room lit up intermittently, but she couldn't see anyone. Then everything didn't stop. Shortly after, she heard a soft tapping on the window behind her. Maggie hesitated, then gathered her courage and opened the curtain, but there was no one there. She panicked. It felt like a staged prank, as though something terrible was happening. She tried once again to shake it off and left the bedroom, but she didn't realize a man had appeared, standing silently, staring at her. He didn't move, just stared at her with eerie stillness. Days passed, and she began losing track of time, her mental state deteriorating. The reflection of the man started appearing more often, sometimes standing motionless at the end of the hallway. But this time, it wasn't just a shadow at the end of the hallway. For the first time, he physically appeared, a tall, gaunt figure with hollow eyes, dressed in filthy, tattered clothes. Fear consumed her as she backed into the corner of the room. He was slowly approaching, his face twisted into a sinister grin. In horror, he lunged at her. Maggie was shoved into the large mirror, shattering it into a cacophony of sharp, piercing noise. As she fought back, the man screamed,
"You will be mine."
He gripped her wrists tightly, but in the chaos, he momentarily lost focus, distracted by his own delusions. Desperate to free herself, Maggie grabbed a shard of broken glass and, with all her strength, stabbed his hand. He howled in pain and released her. Maggie seized the moment of his distraction to escape. She ran out of the apartment, calling for help from anyone nearby. Soon, the police surrounded the apartment, and he was captured. He was an abnormal, deranged individual who had been living in an abandoned house nearby for years. He was arrested and placed in a psychiatric facility after being diagnosed with severe mental instability and a history of violent behavior. The police believed he had been stalking Maggie for weeks before his outburst. Even though he was captured, she couldn't shake the feeling that the mirrors in the house still reflected something strange. The trauma lingered within her, and it would take a long time for her to recover. Nightmare neighbor. The old, tall apartment building stood under the dim glow of the streetlights. It was late, and most windows were dark. Rena was standing outside, staring up at the second floor. Her floor. She had lived here for a few months, and the place had always been quiet, until Arthur moved in next door. Rena's apartment was at the end of the hallway on the second floor, and taking out the trash usually only took a few minutes. But tonight, she felt as though someone was watching her. As she was about to turn the corner at the end of the hallway, he was there. Arthur was standing by his door, looking as though he had been waiting for her. He always found excuses to talk and stand uncomfortably close to Rena. She lowered her head, quickly murmured a greeting, and walked toward the stairs. This time, he said nothing. Goosebumps rose on Rena's skin. Something felt different tonight, making her more uneasy than before. Rena entered her apartment and quickly shut the door. She took a moment to calm herself, telling herself she was overreacting. She turned off the lights in the living room, planning to lie in bed and watch TV. It was late, and she was tired, but she wasn't ready to sleep yet. As she walked past the broom closet, she heard a faint sound, a soft rustling from inside. Her heart skipped a beat, and she froze, staring at the closet door. With trembling hands, she reached for the closet door handle. She hesitated. Then she pulled the door open. Arthur was in there, inside her storage closet. For a moment, time seemed to stop. He was just there, staring at her, unblinking, with a twisted smile on his face. He stepped forward, crawling out of the closet like a predator closing in on its prey. She gasped, stumbling backward, unable to believe what she was seeing. She ran into her bedroom, slamming the door shut. But she didn't have time to lock it. The door burst open, and Arthur was right there, his face wild and unhinged. She dashed toward the bathroom, the only place left to hide. She slammed the door shut just as Arthur reached the bedroom. Her hands fumbled with the lock. Rena's back pressed against the cold bathroom wall. Her breaths came in quick gasps as Arthur pounded on the door, trying to break through. The thin wooden door was the only thing separating her from the man who had been stalking her for weeks. His sickening grin etched deeply into her mind. Thankfully, she had her phone. She clutched it tightly, her fingers trembling as she spoke to the police. Her voice was barely a whisper, strangled by the fear gripping her. Arthur pounded on the door again, the wood splintering under the force. Rena knew it couldn't hold much longer. Suddenly, the pounding stopped. She held her breath, pressing her ear to the door, straining to hear any sound. She didn't know if he had left. Had he given up? Arthur stood outside the bathroom door, his eyes wild with anticipation. His patience had run out. His hand hovered over the doorknob. He knew she was cornered, with nowhere to escape. He slowly reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, gleaming knife. His fingers tightened around the handle. Nightmare neighbor. With a single powerful kick, the bathroom door splintered. The door burst open, and Arthur lunged inside, his eyes wide and feral. She backed away, nearly pressing herself against the wall. She screamed at him to stay away, but Arthur didn't stop. He lunged at her, grabbing her arm with a bruising grip. Rena struggled to pull away, but he was too strong. Pain shot down her spine as he twisted her wrist, pinning it against the wall. Her phone slipped from her grasp, falling to the floor. Arthur's face was only inches from hers as he hissed threats, blaming her for always ignoring him when they crossed paths in the hallway. Rena struggled, trying to break free, but he pulled her closer, squeezing tighter. His knife swiped through the air, grazing her arm. She gasped as a sharp pain tore through her skin, leaving her injured and bleeding. The sound of sirens pierced the night air, growing louder as the police rushed toward the apartment building. The flashing lights reflected on the window, like a beacon of hope in the stifling darkness. Inside, Rena's vision blurred with panic and pain. He shoved her against the wall again, laughing maniacally as he brought the knife closer to her neck. Her free hand flailed, fumbling along the counter by the sink and the shelves, searching for anything she could use to defend herself. She grabbed a glass soap bottle and, without thinking, smashed it against Arthur's head. The glass shattered, and he staggered backward, momentarily dazed. Arthur stumbled, and the knife slipped from his grip, falling to the floor. Rena didn't wait. She bolted for the door, clutching her bleeding arm. She fled the bathroom and into the living room, her mind screaming for escape. But Arthur wasn't far behind. Blood streamed down his face from where the glass bottle had struck him. Enraged, he grabbed the knife from the floor and charged toward her. The police stormed the apartment complex. They knew they had to act fast. Rena reached the living room, but her legs gave out, sending her crashing to the floor. She could feel Arthur's looming presence closing in, the knife still in his hand. His eyes were now filled with rage, the twisted delight in them gone. He reached for her, grabbing her hair. Rena winced in pain, struggling to get up, her body screaming for help. Arthur growled.
There's nowhere left to run, girl.
Just as he raised the knife again, the apartment door burst open with a loud crash. The police stormed into the apartment, cutting through the tension. Arthur stubbornly held on to her, refusing to let her go. Seizing the opportunity, Rena stomped on his foot, making him cry out in pain. She ran toward the police, gasping for breath, blood dripping from her arm, but the nightmare was over. Rena sat on the edge of the ambulance, her mind still reeling, her body in shock. She watched as the police loaded Arthur into the back of the car. The flashing lights of the police car faded into the night as they drove away. The Window Stalker. It all started that day, when I was just a child, too young to fully comprehend the horror that was about to unfold. Our home was always cozy, with large windows in the living room that overlooked the beautiful garden outside. I was sitting on the couch with my back to the window, fully immersed in my favorite TV show. My mother was in the kitchen, doing her usual chores, but then something caught my attention. In the reflection of the TV screen, I saw the silhouette of a man. I could see him through the glass, standing motionless in the garden behind me. I thought it was probably my dad, so I didn't turn around. I called out, "Horror story about a truck driver." As soon as I said that, I saw my mom freeze and then rush into the living room. When my mom saw the figure standing outside the window, her face went blank. I had never seen her look so terrified. I turned around. There he was, a stranger, a scruffy man with wild eyes, just standing there staring at us with a sick, twisted grin. He didn't seem to care that he had been spotted. He just smiled wider, almost enjoying the fear he was causing in my mother and me. Without hesitation, my mom yelled, threatening to call the police if he came closer, but I could sense her fear. And then he said something that still chills me to this day. He growled through the glass with a menacing voice. "If you touch that phone, I'll break this window, and neither of you will be safe." My mom hesitated, torn between calling for help and protecting me, unsure of what to do next. His eyes flared with anger as he fumbled with something inside his coat. And then, in the blink of an eye, he lunged toward the back door. I heard him pounding on it, frantically rattling the doorknob. Thank God it was locked. His frustration turned into rage. He screamed, demanding to be let in, threatening that if he got inside, he wouldn't spare us. I was too young to fully grasp the danger we were in. My mom grabbed me, pulling me off the couch, and we ran upstairs. We didn't stop until we reached the top floor, and that's when I saw my uncle, my mom's younger brother. My uncle was standing in the hallway, headphones on, completely unaware of the chaos downstairs. He was a big, muscular man, the kind you wouldn't want to mess with. He used to compete in boxing matches and had won several trophies. My uncle, confused, asked, "What's going on?" as my mom frantically explained. And just as she finished, we heard the man's voice again, coming from downstairs. His voice echoed through the house, saying, "The boogeyman is coming to get you." Those words were etched into my memory. My uncle heard it and told us to lock ourselves in the bathroom and call the police. My mom pulled me into the bathroom, locked the door as instructed, and called 911. I could hear the man downstairs, his voice growing more erratic. Then, the sound of glass shattering echoed throughout the house. My mom and I held our breath, frozen in fear, waiting for what felt like an eternity for something to happen. We waited and prayed that it was over. Footsteps echoed up the stairs. We braced ourselves, fearing the worst. My uncle slowly stepped out of his hiding spot, waiting for the perfect moment to tackle the man, relying on his sharp reflexes as a seasoned boxer. He didn't hold back and swiftly disarmed the man. My uncle saved us. The door swung open, and the police arrived just in time, securing the situation. They arrested the man and informed us that he was a dangerous criminal they had been hunting for some time. That day changed everything. My mom never felt comfortable being alone again and always looked over her shoulder at the windows. If it hadn't been for my uncle, I don't know what would have happened. I still shudder when I think about it. Whispers behind the door. It's been 9 years since that happened, but I still remember it clearly. In the middle of the city, I rented a small apartment in an old, damp-smelling building. With my job as a waiter, it was all I could afford, just enough to get by. Not long after, something strange began to happen. It started with small noises, almost unnoticeable at first. A faint voice, muttering in the middle of the night. I remember waking up that first night, the sound barely audible, like someone whispering on the other side of the wall. The walls weren't well insulated, so I could hear it. At first, I thought it was a dream. The voice was too distant to make out clearly. But soon, the words became clearer, sharper. "Go die." The words echoed in the dark, sending chills down my spine. I sat up, every hair on my neck standing on end. Who would say such a thing? My eyes darted toward the door. I got out of bed, quietly stepping toward the peephole. Slowly, I saw a thin man, shirtless, his face twisted into a wide, terrifying smile. His hand scratched slowly at the door with a single finger, the gentle sound of it sending chills through me. He just stood there, scratching the door and whispering. From that day on, the man became a frequent, unwelcome visitor. Every 2 or 3 nights, he would return, scratching at my door, mumbling, and sometimes singing in a shrill, childlike voice. The sound was terrifying, like a nightmarish lullaby. Every time I looked through the peephole, there he was, whispering threats. I thought about confronting him, flinging the door open, and demanding he stop. But I couldn't see his hands, they were out of view, and I feared he might be holding something dangerous. The mumbling stopped. Everything was silent. I leaned forward, cautiously pressing my ear against the door. Then a loud knock startled me, sending me falling backward. He said,
"I know you're there. Be careful."
But in the daytime, it was as if nothing had happened between us. I'd run into him in the hallway, and he would smile politely, nod, and walk away. I even asked him once why he kept coming to my door at night. He seemed surprised, then confused, denying any knowledge of what I was talking about. One night, I was about to sleep, but I had to grab something from the living room. The mumbling started again, but this time, it felt much closer. I crept toward the bedroom door, checking to make sure it was locked. Thank God it was. But the doorknob turned slowly, rattling as if he was testing it. Then silence for a long while. I didn't know how he had gotten in. I was terrified, but after the silence lasted long enough, I decided to go out and check. I stepped outside. From the corner near the door, I saw my thin neighbor banging his head against the wall, singing something I couldn't understand. I was truly frightened. I tried to talk to him, but he only turned and threatened me. I stumbled back, startled, but he wasn't hurt. He just kept grinning and eventually walked out of the apartment by himself. I decided I had had enough and finally called the police. They took him to a psychiatric ward. He was diagnosed with schizophrenia and had escaped from a mental hospital 2 months earlier. Apparently, he had a violent history. In fact, he had been admitted after attacking a mailman with a shovel and had snuck out undetected. Now I live in another city, far from that building, far from the memories of those nights. But sometimes, I still can't sleep well, unable to shake the feeling that he might come back. The girl in the red dress. The house we moved into after my father's death wasn't anything special, just another old, quiet mansion in the suburbs, far removed from our old life. It had been abandoned for a while, and it was clear why the rent was suspiciously cheap. Overgrown grass and neglected old furniture gave it a forgotten feel. But to my mother, it was home. I was 20 years old, and I dealt with my grief in my own way. Not long after we moved in, I began noticing small things slowly emerging in the house. But the sounds of whispers, creaking noises made me uneasy and anxious living there. It started with scratching, soft, persistent, on the other side of my bathroom door. At first, I ignored it, hoping it was just my imagination. But night after night, the sound continued. Then came the knocking, sometimes at the front door, sometimes at the window. It always came around midnight, but no one could possibly be there. We kept the gate locked, and no one could enter the yard. Yet the knocking continued. I told my mother. She dismissed it, saying, "It's just an old house." But I knew the house wasn't just old, it was holding on to something. One night, I invited my friend Joe to stay over. We were sitting in my room talking about school when we heard voices coming from the kitchen. It was well past midnight. Everyone should have been asleep. Out of curiosity, we pressed our ears against the door. A conversation was happening just outside, but we couldn't make out a single word. We tiptoed into the hallway, but the kitchen was empty, dark, cold. We checked the entire house, nothing. Everyone was asleep. The voices were gone, leaving only a chilling silence. A few weeks later, my brother decided to test his luck. He and his friends thought it would be fun to play with a Ouija board in my room while I was away. They thought it was just a silly, superstitious game. At first, nothing happened. They laughed awkwardly, asking questions but receiving no response. Then one of them froze. His face turned pale, his body stiff like a statue. Without a word, he bolted from the room, his friends close behind, terror in their eyes. Once outside, the guy finally spoke. He had seen her, a girl, standing at the bathroom door, wearing a red dress, her hand on the knob, staring at them. He said she couldn't have been older than 13, and her eyes were filled with something he couldn't describe. Fear, anger, curiosity. When my brother told me this, I thought he was just trying to scare me. Of course, I didn't believe him. Why would I? I had never seen her. But the story haunted me, lodged deep in my mind like a splinter I couldn't remove. Later, I had a birthday party at a friend's house. Jordan, a friend of mine, got drunk, so I took him to my room and told him to stay there until he sobered up. He collapsed onto the bed and fell asleep. Later, I went to check on him. The room was pitch black, with only a faint light coming from the bathroom. Jordan wasn't in bed. He was sitting at the bathroom door, one leg in, one leg out, talking to no one. I tapped his shoulder. He jumped, then looked at me, confused. He glanced back at the bathroom, then at me again. He mumbled, "I thought I was talking to you, but I just laughed it off, thinking he was too drunk." The next day, he explained, I was teasing him, but he was dead serious. In his drunken state, he had seen a girl in the bathroom. She was wearing a red dress, standing in the middle of the bathroom, asking why he was there. And when I walked in, she disappeared. It didn't stop there. The hauntings, the knocking, the voices continued. My fear grew as one by one. People close to me began talking about an entity that I had never seen in this house. I left my room and went to talk to my mother. While we were on vacation, my aunt and uncle stayed at the house. When we returned, they were sleeping on the living room floor, terror etched across their faces. They said the shower in my room kept turning on by itself, and the radio too, making it impossible for them to stay inside. My mother had no choice but to confront the landlady, who initially denied everything. But the truth came out. The landlady's mother had lived in this house as a teenager with her twin sister, who had ended her life in the bathroom wearing a red dress. It was all true. The red dress, the girl, the spirit trapped within the walls of our home. I didn't know how I was going to convince my mother to leave, but since we were struggling financially, it was piling up. So I had no choice but to stay in the house a little longer. The girl in the red dress. The days that followed were tense, filled with a thick sense of unease that blanketed the house. My mother decided we should move out and find a new place to live. However, things weren't settled yet, and we faced difficulties. So we had to stay in the house a little longer to figure things out. That was our last night in the house. I couldn't sleep. The woman in the red dress kept lingering, haunting my mind. I lay in bed, wrestling with these thoughts until I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to see the house one last time. I got out of bed and walked through the dark hallway. I headed to the bathroom, where it all began. As I reached the bathroom, a chill filled the air, heavy with tension. I hesitated at the doorway, feeling something preventing me from turning on the light. I stepped inside, the cold tiles pressing against my feet, and then I felt another presence in the room. Fear gripped me tightly. Her presence was so strong, I could feel her breath on the back of my neck. I didn't dare turn around, didn't dare move. As I stood in the darkness of the bathroom, a cold hand rested on my shoulder, and a flood of images of the girl in the red dress filled my mind. It was as if she was showing me her story. Buried for decades, the girl, now known to me as Maria, had lived in this house long ago. She was intelligent and talented, but her life was full of suffering because her twin sister was always more favored for her beauty. Everything about Maria seemed overshadowed by her sister. As the years passed, she felt trapped in her own home, living in her sister's shadow, who seemed to have everything Maria longed for. The breaking point came when her sister fell in love with a man. They planned to marry, with their parents' blessing. But Maria, who had quietly loved the same man, was devastated. Even her own chance at happiness was taken from her. Unable to bear the pain, Maria spent much of her time in the small bathroom. It became her sanctuary, the only place where she could escape the suffocating presence of her sister, and the life she felt was never meant for her. One night, overwhelmed by sorrow and loneliness, she made a tragic decision. She thought that leaving this world would make things better, and she ended her life in that very bathroom. Her sister, consumed by guilt, left the house in grief, but Maria's spirit remained bound to the house, trapped in the place where she had taken her own life. As the images faded, I understood the profound despair of Maria. Her spirit had lingered all these years, waiting for someone to recognize her pain. But now, as I stood there in the bathroom, I felt a strange connection with her. The sorrow that had once filled the room was replaced with an intense urge to help her find peace. I whispered, trembling, calling Maria's name. I told her, I understand what you've been through. You don't deserve to be so alone. I'll leave, and you don't need to stay here anymore. It's time to let go and find peace. In that moment, the cold hand on my shoulder lifted. The oppressive air slowly began to ease. For the first time since we moved in, it felt as if the house itself had released its hold on her after all this time. That night, I slept in my bed without fear, no knocking, scratching, or voices. Everything had disappeared. Perhaps she had finally left, freeing herself from the chains she had once forged. The next morning, as we packed the last of our belongings into the car, I looked back at the house one last time. The sun shone brightly, casting a warm glow over the old, stately mansion. As we drove away, I felt that Maria had found the peace she longed for. The house was just a house now, no longer haunted by the sorrow of the past. And though I know I will never return, I will always remember Maria, the poor girl in the red dress, who finally found the freedom she had been denied in life. Haunting delivery trip. I was working for a food delivery platform on weekends to make some extra money. Between my main job and this side gig, I often felt exhausted. It was past 9 p.m. when I started my shift, picking up small orders and delivering them to random houses. After my first delivery, I drove around the area for a while, waiting for something to come through. 20 minutes passed with nothing. Just as I was about to give up, my phone buzzed with an order for just 1 tacos and a drink. I confirmed the order and headed to the restaurant to pick it up. After grabbing the order, I began the 10-minute drive to the customer's house. It was a normal neighborhood, nothing unusual. As I approached a red light, I noticed a pickup truck stop next to me. Instinctively, I glanced over. The guy in the truck was leaning out of the window, staring straight at my car. I looked away when the light turned green and pressed the gas. I glanced in my rearview mirror. The truck was now in my lane, driving a short distance behind me. As I approached the neighborhood where I was making the delivery, the truck was still behind me. Was he following me? The route was mostly straight, so I wasn't sure if he was just heading in the same direction. I tried to stay calm, but the moment I turned into the neighborhood, I knew. The pickup truck turned in too. Maybe he lived here, I thought. I continued driving through the quiet suburban streets, following the GPS until I reached the final road, a dead end. I braked and parked on the side of the road near the house number I had to deliver to. The truck followed and parked behind me. I sat there, frozen, trying to come up with a plan for the worst-case scenario. What was this guy doing? Was he really following me? I glanced at my phone and saw a message from the customer asking, "When will the food arrive?" Could it be the guy in the truck? Was he the customer waiting for me to step out? I felt more trapped than ever. The man got out of the truck. My heart pounded as I watched him slowly approach my car. He stopped right by my trunk, his face partially hidden in the shadows. Then, out of nowhere, he grabbed something like a metal rod and slammed it into my rear windshield. The glass shattered around me. I screamed and, without thinking, instinctively slammed my foot on the gas. The man jumped onto the back of my car, nearly lying flat as he tried to crawl through the shattered window. I swerved sharply, making a U-turn, and felt him fall off the car. My hands trembled as I maneuvered between the trucks. In the rearview mirror, I saw him stumbling in the street as I sped away. My hands shaking, I picked up the phone to call the police. By the time the police arrived, the man had vanished. All they found were shards of glass scattered across the road. They searched the area, but he was gone. I stood staring at the cracks in my shattered windshield, and memories of the terrifying experience replayed in my mind. I was lucky to have escaped, but deep down I still felt uneasy because he was still out there, haunting delivery trip. It's been almost a month since that horrifying night. I haven't driven for the delivery app since then. Every time I think about driving, the echo of shattering glass floods my mind. I try to tell myself it was just an incident, that I was unlucky. There were no witnesses. The police reassured me they'd find him, saying it was probably just a disturbed person trying to scare me. But I couldn't shake the feeling that there had to be some reason he was following me. I decided to try driving again. I needed the money, and I couldn't let fear control my life. I told myself that this time I'd be careful and avoid driving too late at night, and I'd stay away from isolated neighborhoods. As I got into the car, that familiar fear washed over me. My hands were sweaty. I tried to close my eyes, take a deep breath, and turn the key in the ignition. Things started off fine. I was careful and checked my mirrors more frequently. But as the sun set, my phone buzzed with an order that sent a chill down my spine. 1 taco and a drink. A simple order, just like that night. I hesitated, my thumb hovering over the accept button. I figured it was just a coincidence, so I accepted the order. A light drizzle had begun. The drive to Taco felt eerie, as if I was retracing the same steps as that night. I picked up the order and placed it on the passenger seat. As I drove to the delivery address, waves of anxiety hit me. The house was in a different neighborhood, but each turn felt strangely familiar. When I parked at the curb, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. The headlights of a car behind me suddenly flicked on. I looked, it was a truck, and it looked just like the one from that night. Panic set in as the truck rolled closer, its blinding headlights on full beam. The truck parked right behind me, as if waiting for me to make a move. I tried to text my customer, but I was shaking so badly I couldn't type properly, wasting precious time. Suddenly, a notification popped up on my phone. Customer, when will my order arrive? I couldn't believe it and dropped my phone right then. It was happening again. Could he have been waiting for this moment to get revenge? I couldn't go through this again. I had to act. I pressed the gas, moving my car to another spot. The truck slowed down behind me, its headlights glaring blindingly in my rearview mirror, causing me to squint. Suddenly, the truck surged forward, crashing into the back of my car. The impact jerked me forward, my chest slamming into the steering wheel. Pain shot through my ribs as I gasped, trying to catch my breath. I pressed the gas harder, but the rain had made the road slick, so I had to maintain control to avoid crashing. Panic hit me as he pulled up alongside, rolled down his window, and gave me a sinister smile. Another slam. The back of my car crumpled, and I felt something wet trickling down my head. My head had been injured and was bleeding from the impact against the window when he rammed me again. I braked hard, dazed, my vision blurring from the blood running down my face and the sharp pain in my side. But I couldn't give up. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911 for help. I could see his silhouette through the rain, stepping out of his truck. I refused to give up, flooring the gas and driving blindly. My car slammed into a tree. Desperate to survive, I fumbled for the door handle, trying to get out before he got too close. In the distance, I could hear him screaming angrily. I forced myself to run, sprinting toward the woods at the edge of the road. Suddenly, I tripped. My ankle twisted and sharp pain shot up my leg. I couldn't move. He was almost on top of me, his shadow looming as I tried to crawl toward the edge of the road. I turned to face him. He raised the crowbar high above his head, ready to strike, and I screamed. But then, the sound of police sirens cut through the quiet rain. He froze, trying to run, but it was too late. The police used a taser and tackled him to the ground. He was finally caught. I fainted, slowly losing consciousness. Paramedics loaded me into an ambulance, and a wave of relief washed over me. The nightmare was finally over. Mysterious driver in the desert. Gavi was driving down an empty desert highway, stretching for miles, barren and silent. He had been driving for hours. The only sound was the crackling of his car's radio, which seemed to be breaking down, with only static and the occasional country tune. This was one of the rare times Gavi passed through here. He glanced at his dashboard map. No towns, no gas stations for miles, just an empty, desolate road. As Gavi approached a small hill on the road, he felt a sense of relief. The slight slope broke the endless flatness, providing a brief change. But as he went downhill, something caught his attention in the distance. At first, he couldn't tell what it was. Just a shape, a dark figure faintly illuminated by the moonlight. But as he got closer, the figure took form a person standing on the side of the road. Gavi slowed down, squinting to get a better look. It was a woman, standing alone in the middle of nowhere. She wore a long white dress and had pale skin. Her long black hair hung over her face as if soaked in water. Gavi muttered, wondering what she was doing out here. There was nothing for miles. No cars, no houses. How did she even get here? Gavi slowed the car further, considering whether to stop. Maybe she was lost. But as he got closer, something sent a chill down his spine. Her hair looked too wet, as if she had just walked out of a rainstorm, even though the desert had been dry for weeks. And her face, what little he could see of it, her eyes were too large, unblinking, staring straight at Gavi through the wet strands of hair. He hit the gas, speeding past her in fear. Even though he tried to convince himself she was just a lost traveler or perhaps a prank, Gavi couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. Minutes passed, and Gavi continued driving through the endless desert, the eerie calm returning. He kept glancing in the rear-view mirror, feeling as if someone was watching him. He shook his head, trying to stay focused, but then Gavi saw another hill in the distance, just like the one he had passed earlier. And after a short drive, there she was again. The same woman, the same white dress, the same wet hair covering her face. But this time, she was closer to the road, and her smile was even wider, more unnatural. Gavi couldn't believe his eyes. How could she have gotten here before him? There was no way she could have moved that fast. He didn't think twice and slammed his foot on the gas, speeding forward to get past her. This time, Gavi didn't dare look back. Another hill appeared ahead, and the familiar fear tightened in Gavi's chest. He didn't want to go over it, didn't want to see her again, but he had no choice. His worst fear came true. She was there again, standing and waving at him. Her smile now impossibly wide, stretching nearly from ear to ear, and her cold, soulless eyes stared directly at Gavi. Maybe she was some sort of hallucination conjured by his imagination. No matter how much he tried, the fear continued to gnaw at him. He had heard the stories of haunted highways, of strange ghosts appearing to night travelers, but he had never believed them until now. He couldn't keep driving and needed to stop to escape this cursed road. But there was no exit, no rest stop. Gavi felt trapped with no way out. And then, the radio started crackling again. He reached out with a trembling hand to adjust the dial. But before he could turn it off, Gavi felt something cold touch the back of his neck. He froze. Reaching from behind the driver's seat was a pair of pale white hands. The fingers wrapped around his face, slowly digging their nails into his skin. Gavi was now about to face something he didn't understand, and he still had a secret he was hiding. Mysterious driver in the desert. Those fingers, they were slowly tightening around Gavi's face. They were icy cold. Cold like the touch of death itself. He was frozen in place. Slowly, with fear creeping down his spine, he turned to look. Gavi couldn't see the face those hands belonged to, but he had the sense it was a woman. Was it the woman? The one he'd passed many times on the highway? His mind was flooded with horror. The car swerved violently as the grip on him tightened. The tires screeched against the road. The car was losing control. The car veered off the highway, crashing into the rocky terrain with a sharp, grating sound. The impact was brutal, throwing him against the steering wheel as the airbag deployed. Pain surged through his body. Gavi's head hit the window, and for a moment, everything seemed to blur. Smoke rose from the crumpled hood, the headlights flickering dimly on the dark horizon. Gavi's vision swam as he tried to focus. He was still alive. Gavi could feel blood trickling down one side of his face. His limbs were heavy, weighed down. He tried to move, but his body wouldn't respond. Then, he blacked out. In the distance, a car approached. The officer, a seasoned man who had seen his share of accidents, stepped out of his vehicle, his flashlight cutting through the desert's dark night. The car was a wreck. Twisted metal and shattered glass scattered across the rocky ground. Smoke still rose from the engine. The officer cautiously approached. The officer, Jay, shone his flashlight through the driver's side window. His eyes widened in shock when he saw the body still strapped into the seatbelt. After checking the license plate, he realized it was someone named Gavi. His head was twisted at a strange angle, almost wrenched to the side, and his eyes wouldn't close, wide open as if staring right at me. His face frozen in a horrifying grimace, blood smeared across his skin. But just as Jay started to step back, he heard something. A sound like someone crying, but it was muffled, as if something was blocking their mouth. The sound came from the trunk. At first, it was faint, barely audible. But as Jay leaned in to investigate, it grew louder, more desperate. It was a sobbing, painful cry, like that of a child trapped inside. Panic surged through the officer as he ran to the back of the car. His hands trembled as he fumbled with the trunk latch. Jay's mind raced with questions. Who could be inside? What had happened? 2 cases at once? The trunk lid sprang open. Jay's flashlight illuminated a haunting sight inside the cramped trunk, a little girl. A young girl, bound and gagged. Her wrists and ankles were tied tightly with thick, rough rope, and her mouth was sealed with tape. Tears streamed down her pale face, her eyes wide with fear. Not just that clutched tightly to her chest was a doll. The doll wore a white dress, its skin pale and cracked with age, its face fixed in a disturbingly wide smile. Large, dark eyes stared back, and its long black hair appeared wet, hanging loose. Jay reached out to touch the doll, and then its head moved. The girl sobbed, her body trembling as she clung to the doll. Jay staggered back, the weight of the doll's gaze pressing on him. He turned away, his breath becoming ragged, his heart pounding in his chest. The officer fought back his rising panic. It was just a coincidence, he told himself. He quickly untied the girl and removed the tape from her mouth. She gasped for air, sobbing loudly. Jay reassured the girl and led her to his patrol car. He called for backup. From the moment they got into the car, the doll sat there, staring at him, and he couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching him, studying him with its eerie and unsettling gaze. Soon after, backup and paramedics arrived. The girl was taken to the hospital, still clutching the doll, which baffled him. Her small hands clung to it as if it were the only thing tethering her. As the ambulance drove away, Jay remained haunted by the strange presence of the doll. He pondered the mysterious events leading up to the crash. Even though the girl had been rescued, the story felt far from over. It seemed to have slipped beyond Jay's understanding, perhaps into another world entirely. The woman disappeared in white clothes. I grew up hearing stories from my cousin, who worked at the local police station. He was the kind of person who had seen it all. But there's one story he told me that always sent chills down my spine, and it's true. This story is about the mysterious woman in white. It all started with a midnight call from a gas station attendant. My cousin's colleague, Officer Nathan, was working the night shift. The attendant claimed he had been robbed, and the thief fled before he called. A woman in a white dress with long black hair, incredibly beautiful. Strangely, the suspect wasn't a masked figure or some shady guy, but a woman. He explained that she had come to him, asking for help because she was lost in the middle of the night. He had gone to the office to notify his boss, but when they returned to the cash register, she was gone, and so was all the money. Nathan, the only officer on duty so late, immediately got in his patrol car and headed to the gas station. It was a deserted road, winding through the woods on the outskirts of town. As Nathan drove, his headlights caught movement up ahead. A dark shadow was slowly walking toward him. Walking alone in the opposite direction was a woman in a white dress. She matched the attendant's description exactly. He accidentally passed her by, but unsure if his eyes were deceiving him, he saw that she had no face as he drove by. Finding it too unbelievable, he slowed down and reversed to check if she was indeed the woman the gas station attendant had described. After reversing, he stopped and quickly stepped out of the car, saying, "You need to get in the car and come with me to the police station immediately." She said nothing and complied. On the drive back to the station, he asked her a few questions about why she had stolen the money. However, she didn't say a word. He looked through the rearview mirror as she sat in the back seat, staring intently at one spot until they arrived at the station. Her behavior was strange, so he thought the woman might have mental issues. After that, he decided not to ask her any more questions. When they got back to the station, they began interrogating her, but she still didn't speak. His shift was almost over, so he prepared to hand over the report to the incoming officers. Just before he was about to leave, she suddenly started talking. She gestured and spoke, promising to return the money the next day if they let her spend the night in the holding cell at the station. She kept insisting that she had nowhere to go, and the officers were quite confused by what she was saying, unsure of what to do. Nathan reported to his superiors. He was informed that they couldn't move her to another holding facility that day. So in the end, they agreed to her request and placed her in the holding cell. Before leaving, Nathan made a final call to the gas station, informing the attendant that they had caught the suspect. The money would be returned the next morning, or so they thought. The next morning, Nathan returned to the station. As he approached the woman's cell, he witnessed a horrifying scene. The cell was empty. The woman they had arrested the night before was gone, except for the crumpled body of a man, her cellmate. His face was shredded with deep scratches, his wide eyes frozen in terror, and his body was pinned to the wall with nails driven into the flesh. Scattered around him were bills, and a few banknotes that hadn't been found the day before were stuffed into his pockets. Worse still, scrawled in blood on the wall beside his body were the words, "I have paid the debt." Nathan frantically searched the area. Even more terrifying was that she had completely vanished. No one heard or saw anything. The cameras? They hadn't captured any footage of her entering or leaving the cell. She had disappeared without a trace. A thorough search was conducted. The surrounding area was combed, and every possible lead was followed. But the woman in white was never found. She simply vanished, like a ghost fading into the darkness. Even to this day, no one knows who or what she was, but the officers present that night remain haunted by the incident. That's the whole story my cousin told me. I sat and listened, and I could still see the fear in his eyes when he spoke about her. The question that always haunted me was how she managed to escape from the cell. Was she human, or something far worse? The strangest part is that she evaded all the surveillance cameras. After countless investigations, they still don't know what happened that night or where she went. Stranger in the dark. My family was excited about the trip to my aunt's house. I had always looked forward to spending time with my cousin Luca, my closest companion. We arrived at my aunt's house, surrounded by towering trees. Luca rushed outside, her face lighting up when she saw us. After a while, we headed to the nearby store, eager to grab snacks for movie night. We excitedly filled our hands with treats. As we were about to walk home, a man called out to us. I turned around to see a well-dressed man holding a bag of chips. He smiled warmly, and instinctively, I moved closer. The man handed me the bag of chips, and his friendly demeanor put me at ease. I thanked him and walked away without giving it much thought. Night fell, and the atmosphere in the house changed. We gathered in the living room, surrounded by snacks, as we prepared to watch a movie. Suddenly, a faint sound echoed through the house, sending a shiver down my spine. I exchanged a worried glance with Luca, asking if she had locked the door. She hesitated, unsure, and decided to check. The weight felt unbearable as I stood there. My anxiety grew, and I got up to see why she was taking so long. As I stepped into the hallway, my heart stopped. Luca was lying unconscious on the floor, and a masked man was standing next to her. My breath caught in my throat as panic surged through me. I staggered back, feeling paralyzed with fear. The man noticed me and rushed forward. I turned and ran toward the kitchen, slamming the door shut behind me, locking it just as I heard him pounding on it. I glanced back at the door, the man's pounding echoing in my ears. I couldn't leave Luca behind, even though fear gripped me. Summoning all my courage, I grabbed a plate from the kitchen rack. When the noise outside stopped, I slowly opened the door for a peek. Suddenly, the door burst open, knocking me back. I managed to swing the plate toward him in desperation. It shattered on his head, fragments flying everywhere. Blood streamed from the wound as he staggered back, dazed. I rushed into the kitchen, my hands trembling as I grabbed my phone. I tried to dial for help, but I couldn't press the buttons. I was too shaken, not knowing what to do. I ran to check on Luca. I splashed water on her face, and after a moment she woke up. Confusion replacing her unconscious state. Relief washed over me, but I knew we weren't safe yet. When I heard the man stirring, a cold wave of fear swept over me. I couldn't let him find us. I whispered to Luca that we needed to hide. We crept into the kitchen and hid behind the counter. The door creaked open, and I held my breath. I peeked out and saw him searching for us, his eyes scanning the room with a predator's hunger. Fear suffocated me as I gripped Luca's hand tightly. I heard him coming closer, his footsteps making my stomach churn. The sound stopped, and for a moment, silence blanketed the house. Then the lights flickered, plunging us into darkness. Suddenly, I shuddered as a cold hand gripped my shoulder. I turned around, and it was Luca, her eyes wide with fear. I could barely see the silhouette of the man in the darkness. Instinctively, I crept forward again, pulling Luca toward the back door, where the faint moonlight streamed in. We dashed outside, running frantically toward the trees that surrounded my aunt's property. We heard the man's laughter echoing through the trees, sending chills down my spine. We spotted a narrow path ahead, leading deeper into the woods. We had no other choice. The path opened up to a cliff overlooking a dark abyss. Panic surged inside me. There was nowhere left to run. Luca and I slowly backed away, but the man kept coming closer. his eyes gleaming with malice. I could feel my heart racing as I tried to reason with him, my voice trembling. He lunged at us, and instinctively, I pushed Luca aside. In a desperate attempt, I grabbed a sharp rock from the ground and held it out, ready to defend us. The man laughed, unfazed by my feeble weapon. He lunged again, but this time I dodged to the side. In the chaos, the man stumbled, losing his balance at the edge of the cliff. Time seemed to slow as I watched him teeter on the brink, his expression shifting from confidence to panic. He flailed, reaching out into the air. With one last gasp, he slipped and fell off the cliff, his scream fading into the night. Luca and I stood frozen, gasping for breath, our hearts pounding. We looked at each other, the reality of what had just happened sinking in. Finally, we followed the path back home. We rushed back home, locking the door behind us. I collapsed onto the chair, trembling, while Luca sat next to me, her eyes wide in disbelief. I realized the gravity of everything and decided to call the police about the horrifying events. I felt grateful because just a little more, and we could have lost everything. The neighbor's dark secret. I often have insomnia, so I often choose to stand at the balcony door, looking out at the quiet neighborhood. I live in a really isolated neighborhood. The houses around here are not right next to each other, although I do have a neighbor who has a fence that I can see over if I stand on the balcony. I'm not being nosy or anything, but that night, I was looking into his yard. I've never met him because that neighbor just moved in, but I assume he lives alone because there's only one black truck parked in his yard. Today, I continued to go to the balcony and look at his yard. The truck had been missing for a week. I played the game of observing the truck at night and theorizing about its purpose, even though that was none of my business. Suddenly, one day, I saw him. My neighbor walked out of the house, dragging something. It looks like it's a long, black bag. It looked quite heavy, and it took him a lot of strength to pull it. On the ground, there is a leak of something that looks thick. He struggled to lift it, then pulled it toward the truck, sliding the side door open. He stuffed the bag into the trunk before driving away, then glanced around as if checking to make sure no one was watching. I stood there, my mind spinning. I couldn't ignore it anymore. So I called the police. They arrived quickly and checked around his property. I stayed, watching from the window as they spoke to him, but then his demeanor was completely different. He led the police to one of his bags, opened it, and inside was meat. He started pointing at his dog, which barked eagerly as he lifted it, filled with excitement. The screams, he claimed, were just him rehearsing a scene from his favorite TV show, and he did it every night. The police found nothing else. To protect my identity, the police came inside and spoke privately about me calling them. They warned me. They said if I continued calling without evidence, I could be charged with privacy violation and harassment. When they left, my neighbor came over, placing a hand on my shoulder. With a friendly smile, he said, "Let's not let little misunderstandings get out of hand, all right?" It felt like a warning. I told myself I was overreacting. Maybe he really was just an odd guy, with strange habits. Every night, I hear faint, muffled, haunting screams. I tell myself it's just him rehearsing, as he said. Then one evening, he showed up at my door holding a cake. He told me it was his birthday and gave me the cake to clear up any unnecessary misunderstandings between us. Was he smiling? I wasn't sure if it was my mind playing tricks, but I felt like he was giving a sinister smile behind my back, waiting for something. As I closed the door, a wave of fear came over me. I took the cake into the kitchen. I placed the cake on the table, not daring to eat it, and just stared at it for a while. I considered eating it, dismissing my paranoia, and slowly brought it to my mouth. But then, something like an instinct told me not to. I put it down, reminding myself to stay alert. Thinking of him preparing it, watching me, knowing I'd eat it. It was truly horrifying. I grabbed the cake, took it to the trash bin behind the house, and threw it away. I didn't care if I was being unreasonable. I'd rather be safe than sorry. Early the next morning, when I went out to take out the trash behind the house, something caught my eye. There, beside the trash bin, was a small mouse, dead. Its tiny body lay still, right next to where I had thrown the cake the night before. A thin trail of cake crumbs led from the cake to the mouse. The mouse had eaten the cake and died. His depravity was beyond imagining. The cake was not a gift, it was a warning. From that moment, I started watching. Every sound, every strange occurrence, every word from my neighbor. Now I knew he wasn't just a harmless eccentric. He was hiding something dark. Everything started again when I walked past my neighbor's house. My steps slowed as I glanced at his front door, catching sight of a hand pressed against the glass, moving frantically. The glass was old and foggy. I saw someone inside, exhaling and writing help on the dust-covered window. For a second, I turned away, rushing back home. I didn't want to know what was happening behind that door. Back in bed, I couldn't sleep. The image of that pleading face, the desperate scrawl on the window, kept replaying in my mind. The sounds, the black bag, the screams. If I reported this to the police, I knew he'd find a way to cover it up, like he always did. Without evidence, everything would be pointless. I needed a clear and specific plan. I decided to reach out to my friend. I met my friend at the local cafe and explained everything, detailing the strange events and horrific scenes. He looked at me, skeptical, but didn't dismiss it right away. We had known each other for so long, neither of us wanted to believe this was happening. Then he suggested gathering photo and video evidence using advanced technology to avoid detection. I had to do whatever it took to prove my words. Neither of us could imagine what we were about to do next. But I promised him that we would only collect evidence and leave quickly and discreetly. The next morning, I put on a plumber's uniform and a fake mustache, mentally preparing for my decision. I approached my neighbor's door, disguised as a plumber. He opened it, eyeing me strangely, scrutinizing. He glanced at my house, then back at me, asking, "Nick, is that you?" I froze for a moment. I began faking my voice, using a different tone to deceive him, explaining I was sent to check and fix the city's main water pipes. At first, he seemed suspicious and told me to wait a moment before closing the door. I stood outside, not knowing what he was doing inside, waiting and adjusting my glasses. But eventually, he acted friendly and allowed me inside. As I entered, the house was much tidier than I had expected, and nothing suggested he was a murderer. As I pretended to inspect the pipes under his kitchen sink, he stayed close, following me throughout the house. My every move was under his watch. I hadn't anticipated this. His presence was a constant reminder that one wrong move could be my last. I racked my brain for a way to separate myself from him. Then, an idea struck. I asked him to let me check the pipes in the basement, explaining that I needed to inspect the pipes there, adding, "If you come with me, you'll need to be careful. A broken pipe could be very dangerous and make things worse." He hesitated, but finally, he allowed me to go down to the basement alone. I watched his shadow disappear into the darkness. I turned my attention to the house, moving quietly, looking through every corner, hoping to find something out of place. And then I saw it, an edge jutting out along a wall, as if something was being hidden. My fingers brushed along the edge, feeling the rough texture beneath my hand. With a gentle push, the panel creaked open, releasing a foul stench that made me nauseous. I hesitated. Well, would I pro? The smell was nearly unbearable, but curiosity overpowered my fear. I cautiously stepped closer, peering inside. There, in the dim light, I saw a long streak on the floor leading to black bundles that were oozing blood. Then I saw dozens of bodies, skeletal remains intertwined with decomposing corpses. Just as I was about to turn and escape, a cold hand gripped my shoulder. "Hello, my neighbor," a familiar voice whispered in my ear, full of malice. I felt the pressure of his grip tightening, but before I could react, he shoved me forward, standing in front of the door, blocking my only exit. His eyes showed satisfaction. I reached for my phone and pressed the emergency alarm button, just as my friend and I had planned beforehand. He quickly snatched the phone from my hand. Then there was a crackling sound as he crushed it underfoot. I realized I was truly trapped. The police stormed into the house unexpectedly. My friend, true to his word, had taken action when he received my emergency signal. He had told me beforehand that he would alert a trusted officer in case anything happened. The neighbor began to flee, but during the pursuit, he couldn't escape our plan. He was caught and couldn't deny the overwhelming evidence. When I handed over all the footage and he was taken into custody, I lay in the hospital thinking about what I'd been through. I had come closer to death than I ever imagined. I regretted nothing. The mystery behind a portrait. Moving in with Eric was supposed to be the start of something beautiful, but the moment she crossed the threshold, an unsettling chill enveloped her. Jamie's gaze settled on a large painting prominently displayed in the living room. It was a portrait of a beautiful woman with long, dark hair and piercing eyes. From the moment she saw it, she felt deeply uneasy. The woman's eyes seemed strangely alive. Jamie shivered, feeling the weight of those eyes on her. She thought it was watching her. She glanced at Eric, who was arranging painting supplies nearby.
It's just a painting, Jamie.
He reassured her with a soft laugh, but something inside her didn't agree. As Jamie lay in bed, she couldn't shake the image of the woman's piercing gaze. It felt as though the woman in the painting wanted to tell her something. Then one night, she had a nightmare, the woman stepping out of the painting. A cold hand gripped her arm, and the woman in the painting whispered one chilling word.
Run.
Jamie jolted awake in panic. She could still feel her presence in the room, her eyes burning into Jamie. After another sleepless night, she asked Eric to move the painting out of their shared space, and reluctantly he agreed. He moved it to his office, but the unease remained, growing with each passing day. Instead of feeling relieved, things only got worse. He spent hours in his office with the painting, muttering to himself in soft, frantic whispers. When he appeared, his arms were scratched and bruised, as if he had fought with something or someone. Jamie's suspicion grew. One night, after Eric had fallen asleep, Jamie gathered her courage and snuck into his office, determined to uncover what was going on. As Jamie got closer to the painting on the wall, the woman's eyes now looked fiercer than ever. Her hands trembled, but she forced herself to take a photo with her phone. Jamie began researching the image. Her heart sank as she found an old article. The woman in the painting was real, a young woman named Anna who had disappeared years ago. The last person seen with her alive was her boyfriend, who also vanished without a trace. She looked closer at the image of Anna. There was an eerie coincidence, her earrings. They were identical to the pair Eric had given her on their 1-month anniversary. With fear rising, Jamie's eyes darted around the room, searching for more clues. She noticed a white cloth over an easel, as if Eric was preparing to start a new painting. But what caught her attention was a knife lying next to his paintbrushes. Suddenly, Jamie felt a chill run down her spine. She turned back to the painting, and this time, Anna's expression had changed. Her mouth twisted and moved, forming the exact word Jamie had heard in her nightmare.
Run.
Jamie turned around, panic engulfing her. Eric was standing in the doorway, his face darkened with anger. He began asking her what she was doing there. Jamie backed away, but he continued advancing, gripping the knife tightly and saying that she knew too much. As he raised the knife, Jamie bolted, running down the hallway as fast as she could. She ran toward the door, fumbling with her phone to dial 911. But Eric was faster. He grabbed her by the neck just as she reached the front door, pulling her back with terrifying strength. Just when she thought it was all over, she heard sirens blaring outside. The police burst in. They quickly subdued Eric, pinning him to the ground as he thrashed and screamed in rage. While searching the house, the police found ample evidence behind a hidden door in Eric's basement. Behind it was a small, dusty room filled with Anna's belongings. But the most chilling discovery was Anna's decaying body hidden in Eric's basement. Finally, her spirit was set free. Before leaving, Jamie returned to Eric's office one last time. Anna's painting still hung on the wall. Her eyes were gentle, her face no longer twisted in fear or sorrow. Instead, she looked at Jamie with gratitude. Underground parking and mysterious people. I worked the night shift at an apartment complex downtown. The job seemed simple enough: monitor cameras, patrol, and ensure the building's security. The building was constructed in the late 60s, and its design left many vulnerable entry points in the parking garage. The association was concerned about security, especially with the occasional break-ins and homeless people finding shelter in the hidden corners of the basement. I had worked here for months, and every night I would check every nook and cranny. Most nights were quiet, normal, even boring. Until tonight. I walked through the dimly lit parking garage, my footsteps echoing. The place was a maze of dead spaces and blind spots. Too many places to hide. Too many areas the cameras couldn't see. My flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing only parked cars and empty spaces. I always hated the door that led to a dead-end hallway. It was an isolated corridor that led nowhere, just a locked door that couldn't be opened from the inside, as if it held some history better left unknown. As I approached the door, it was wide open. A cold wave of fear washed over me. The door was supposed to be locked tight. I swept my flashlight down the narrow hallway. There was nothing, just an empty glass bottle lying on the ground. My anxiety spiked. The thought of stepping into the hallway made me uneasy. I didn't want to get trapped in there, especially knowing the door locked from the outside. But procedure is procedure. I had to follow it, and I couldn't just leave the bottle there. Reluctantly, I stepped inside. I moved toward the bottle, my flashlight reflecting off the cold gray walls. Each step felt heavier than the last. I bent down, picked up the bottle, and stood up. But then, the sound that chilled me to the bone, the door slammed shut behind me. I rushed to the door, panic rising in my chest, and grabbed the handle. It was locked. I pounded on the metal door, screaming for help, but the thick concrete walls swallowed my cries. My heart raced as I realized no one was coming. It was 3 a.m. and I was trapped. I tried my phone, no signal. The thick walls and metal door blocked everything. I was completely cut off from the outside world. I leaned against the cold wall, trying to calm myself down. The flashlight was my only lifeline in the stifling darkness. I switched it off to save the battery, but I could still hear echoes from somewhere. Then the sound of car alarms blared, one after the other. Whoever had locked me in was out there, doing whatever they wanted, smashing car doors, stealing whatever they could. After what felt like hours, I heard footsteps. It was a miracle. Someone was out there, and I had to make them hear me. I pounded on the door with all my strength, shouting loudly. Finally, a deep, raspy voice answered from the other side, and after a moment, the lock clicked. The door opened, and I felt a wave of relief. A passerby, on their way to work early, had heard my banging. I thanked them profusely as I stumbled out of the hallway, my legs shaking, but my relief didn't last long. As I returned to the basement, chaos greeted me. Windows were shattered, glass littered the concrete floor. At least a dozen cars had been broken into, valuable items stolen. Whoever locked me in knew exactly what they were doing. They had silenced the alarms after each car was hit, leaving behind damage worth tens of thousands of dollars. My heart sank. I knew what was coming next. When the morning shift arrived and the residents discovered the theft, the police would be called, and I would be fired. Security had been breached under my watch, and though it wasn't my fault, I was the one held responsible. Weeks later, after I had quit, the mystery still haunted me. I replayed the events of that night over and over in my head. How did they know exactly where to trap me? How did they avoid the cameras so perfectly? No one was ever caught. The footage showed nothing, just me, doing my rounds. As I walked, I didn't see a thing. Maybe they knew the blind spots of the place too well. Months had passed, but tonight, that phone call pulled me back to the core of everything. I walked into the parking garage. I approached the dead-end hallway, my heart pounding harder with every step. The door was ajar. Just like that night, I could feel the weight of the past pressing on me, daring me to confront it. There was something I missed before. I stood at the entrance, staring, then cautiously moved forward as my senses sharpened. This time, I was ready for whatever I might face. No more running. Then I saw him. It was probably the man who trapped me. His gaunt face was pale and dirty, his hollow eyes fixed on me. He stood still, almost like a statue, as if he had been waiting for me all this time. A chill ran down my spine. The man wasn't a ghost or a specter, he was real. My voice trembled as I spoke. "Who are you? Why did you do this?" The man didn't move at first, but then, slowly, a twisted smile spread across his face, growing wider. He started walking toward me. He started saying something I didn't understand, talking about how I would soon see for myself the secret of this place, the truth I had been afraid of and running from. He said he wasn't just some random drifter that night, and that he had been here much longer than I thought. This building, this place, it wasn't just concrete and steel. It was a prison, and people like him, they were trapped inside. For a moment, his expression darkened. He told me that there are things in this world that feed on fear and suffering. And places like this, they are where they hunt. Now, he was part of its cycle. My mind raced as I tried to understand what he was saying. The truth hit me, and I realized this man wasn't just some random criminal. He was a victim of something much darker, something that had taken hold of him and was now trying to take me too. I stepped back, my heart pounding. "I'm not like you. I can still get out of this." His smile widened again, sinister and mocking. I turned, glancing at the door, thinking about running. I clenched my fists, took one last look at the man, then turned and sprinted toward the door. I could hear his laughter echoing behind me, filling the narrow hallway. I ran through the parking garage, then stopped. Standing there, in the darkness, was another figure, identical to the man in the hallway. I froze. This couldn't be happening. More figures appeared, stepping out from the shadows. Each one looked just like him, pale, gaunt. Maybe they weren't real, but they felt so real, their malicious energy surrounding me. I staggered. That man hadn't been lying. This place, this building, it was still alive. It had taken him, just as it had taken others before him. And now it was my turn. But I wasn't going to let that happen. With one last surge of strength, I got up and ran, not stopping until I was far away from the building, the figures fading into the night behind me. I didn't look back. Safe in my apartment, I sat in the dark, the truth of that night still sinking in. The man, the building. I had escaped, but deep down I knew it wouldn't be that simple. I needed to stay far away from that place and never go back. Run away from strangers. The grocery store sat in the middle of a vast, empty parking lot, bathed in the faint glow of streetlights. It was 2 a.m. The store was closed, and the eerie quiet surrounded it. The night was still, until a soft tapping on the glass echoed in the darkness. I was the night shift manager here. Usually, things were calm, and nothing happened. It was just me, stocking shelves during the quiet hours while the outside world slept. I had been working non-stop since my shift began at 10 p.m., trying to get everything done. My focus was broken when I heard the faint tapping. It was coming from the front of the store. I left my cart and headed toward the sound. Through the large glass windows, I saw him, a man. He was leaning against the glass, trying to peer inside. His clothes were tattered, his face expressionless, with a hollow, vacant look in his eyes. He saw me the moment I came into view. I approached the glass door. I asked him what he wanted. He demanded I open the door. His face was emotionless. No hint of a smile, just cold eyes staring at me. I told him the store was closed and that he couldn't be here. As I turned to walk away, a loud bang startled me. The man's fists were pounding on the glass, over and over, each strike louder and angrier than the last. My heart raced. This guy wasn't just a harmless drifter. I pulled out my phone, showing him I was ready to call the police. Only then did he back off, his eyes still locked on me, filled with rage. Slowly, he stepped back into the shadows of the parking lot. The tension in me eased slightly. He was gone. I put my phone away and tried to focus back on my work. 15 minutes passed. The tapping, the pounding, the man, all of it faded from my mind as I immersed myself in stocking the shelves. But then I heard it, the sound of metal breaking, like something being torn apart. I abandoned the stroller and ran forward, fear rising. My heart sank when I saw the glass door slightly open. The lock, the only thing that kept the door secure, was missing. Fear gripped me as I realized what this meant. I need to go to the office, call the police now. I turned to run for the office, but I froze in place. Standing not far from me, blocking my path, was the man. His expression hadn't changed, still cold, still lifeless, filled with rage. I don't think anything. I just run. I burst through the door, the man right behind me. Suddenly, a beat-up van screeched into view, speeding toward the front of the store. It swerved dangerously, nearly hitting me as it stopped, my heart pounding in my chest. I moved forward, running past the van, but then everything flipped upside down. A sharp pain suddenly exploded at the back of my head. My body lurched forward as I fell to the ground. I didn't even have time to process what had happened before the world started fading. I felt hands grabbing me, roughly lifting me off the cold pavement. My vision blurred, darkness closing in, and the last thing I remembered was the roar of the van's engine and the sensation of being dragged inside. I woke up with a throbbing headache, my wrists tightly bound behind me. The van bounced and swayed as it sped down an unfamiliar road. My mind was foggy, disoriented. For a moment, I didn't know where I was. Then it all came rushing back. I started to string it together. Man, the truck. Perhaps I was kidnapped by him. My heart raced as I realized I needed to act, and fast. I glanced around. Inside, it was pitch black, but I could make out a pile of old tools, a rusted toolbox, and some scattered metal pieces on the floor. I twisted my wrists, testing the ropes. They were tight, but I could feel a slight give, just enough to give me hope. I could hear the driver muttering to himself up front. His voice was low, angry. This wasn't over. I took a deep breath, calming the panic rising inside me. I needed to think, and I needed to get out. I inched closer to the toolbox, my fingers searching for anything sharp. It was hard, but I found a small, jagged piece of rusted metal. I awkwardly twisted my hands, rubbing the metal against the ropes. My heart pounded with every noise the van made, every bump in the road that might expose me, each one painful enough to make me want to scream. Suddenly, I felt the ropes loosen. A few more scratches and they snapped. My wrists were free, but I couldn't move too quickly. I glanced toward the front seat, where I could see the back of the driver's head. He hadn't realized I was awake yet. I noticed the door latch wasn't locked. I needed a plan. The van slowed as it made a sharp turn onto a dirt road. This was the moment I'd been waiting for. Taking a deep breath, I yanked the back door open and jumped into the night. I hit the ground hard, pain shooting through my body as I tumbled over dirt and gravel. For a second, I thought I wouldn't be able to move, but adrenaline surged through me. I staggered to my feet, running into the thick darkness of the trees. Behind me, the van screeched to a stop. I heard the man shouting, his footsteps pounding as he chased after me, but I didn't look back. I just kept running, my heart hammering in my chest. The trees, the branches, scratched at my skin as I tore through the dense underbrush. My mind was foggy, teetering between fear and survival. I could hear the man crashing through the forest behind me, his breath heavy and furious. I couldn't let him catch me again. Ahead, I spotted a clearing and the faint glow of lights through the trees. A road. If I could get there fast, I'd be safe. I burst out of the woods and onto the road, waving my arms frantically as a car approached. The headlights blinded me, but I didn't care. I needed help. I ran into the middle of the road, screaming for them to stop. The car screeched to a halt, and I collapsed against the hood, gasping for breath. The driver jumped out, shouting something, but I was too exhausted to answer. All I could do was whisper, "Help me." The driver pulled out his phone, calling the police. I glanced back at the man. He stood at the edge of the woods, staring at me with cold, furious eyes. But he didn't come any closer. He knew it was over. The flashing lights of police cars lit up the dark road. Officers surrounded the van. The man already in handcuffs not far away. His face was cold, blank, disturbingly empty. I sat on the curb, still trembling, wrapped in a blanket the police had given me. The world felt strange, like a nightmare I couldn't wake from. But I was grateful, lucky to be alive. I was free. The police assured me that he'd be locked away, that he wouldn't hurt anyone else. But the thought still lingered in my mind. What if I hadn't escaped? What if I hadn't been fast enough? As the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, I stood by the car, watching the police take the man away. The fear was still there, clinging to the edges of my mind, but I knew I had survived. I had been lucky to survive the night shift. Stalkers in the dark. I started working as a security guard, night shifting at a small shopping mall in the city right after graduating high school. This job was supposed to be simple. Sit in front of the screen, watch people come and go, and occasionally handle shoplifters or suspicious behavior. But the truth is, the nights can be long, even boring. Until Black Friday arrived in the month leading up to Halloween. I had heard stories about the chaos, people acting as if they were clawing to get the best deals. It was madness, pushing and shoving like a zombie apocalypse. This year, I was scheduled for the dreaded Black Friday shift. It was my second year, and I thought I knew what to expect. What I didn't expect was the note. When I arrived for my shift that evening, I found a note waiting for me on my desk, right in front of the row of CCTV monitors. It simply read, "If you're in the dark, stay indoors." It was puzzling, and I had no idea who it was meant for or what it referred to. I felt a bit uneasy but brushed it off. Maybe it was a prank or something the cleaning crew accidentally left behind. I didn't want to dwell on it and focused on my job. As soon as the mall opened, chaos ensued. People pushed and shoved, scrambling for discounted items. Every walkie-talkie on the team was buzzing non-stop. We had 10 security guards on duty, and it still wasn't enough to manage the madness. Late in the evening, things calmed down a bit until I received a call over the radio. A group of men was reportedly mugging someone with a knife in the third-floor parking lot. I quickly decided to check the cameras to see what I was getting into. As I unlocked the door and swung it open, I nearly bumped into someone. There was a strange man sitting inside. He was standing in front of the screen, wearing a red and green Christmas outfit. His head turned toward the monitor, making me freeze. He slowly turned his face toward me, a pair of sunglasses covering his eyes, even though the room was pitch black. Before I could say a word, he stepped closer, his face just inches from mine, flashing a toothy grin, sharp teeth like a shark's. "Did you get my note?" I reached for the walkie-talkie, but before I could do anything, the lights in the room went out, plunging us into complete darkness. I raised my hands, bracing for him to lunge at me, but instead, I felt nothing. I shone the flashlight, and he had vanished, leaving the room empty with just me standing there. I tried to calm myself and refocus on my pressing duties. The dimly lit corridors of the mall were filled with strange decorations, shadows, and the faint echo of creepy sound effects coming from the nearby costume shop. As I walked around, I noticed something strange. A life-sized mannequin in the costume shop window. It was dressed in an outfit identical to that of the strange man. I turned to look behind me as I heard a noise coming from behind, glancing through the shop's glass. The mannequin was no longer inside. Suddenly, the lights flickered, and I heard a raspy laugh behind me. I turned around, my flashlight cutting through the darkness, and there he was, the man, grinning horrifically and then lunging toward me. I stumbled back, narrowly dodging him. I weaved between the aisles and ran up the escalator, my heart pounding as I tried to put as much distance as possible between us. After what felt like an eternity, I reached the security room and slammed the door shut, locking it tight behind me. I quickly accessed the camera feeds, searching for any sign of the man. My hands trembled as I scrolled through the screens, but I couldn't find him anywhere. Then, on one of the feeds, I saw him standing in the hallway just outside the security room, staring directly into the camera, a sinister smile plastered across his face, waving at me. I grabbed the walkie again, calling for backup, but the signal was distorted. Suddenly, the lights went out, plunging the room into darkness. I hurriedly fumbled for my flashlight. A creaking sound like claws scraping the door echoed. I braced myself, gripping the flashlight like a weapon, as the door swung open and he stepped inside, laughing mockingly at my fear. I remembered the emergency lever behind the desk. Without hesitation, I rushed over, pulling it down just as he reached for me. He lunged at me, and we got caught in a struggle. He was stronger than he looked, his hands clawing at me as I tried to push him away. We slammed into the metal shelves, the impact echoing throughout the room. I pulled the walkie from my belt, calling for backup again. My voice trembled with tension. but I just hoped someone would hear me. After a tense struggle, I pushed him away one last time, and he staggered. This time, I seized the opportunity, quickly grabbing a metal rod nearby and locking it against the door, trapping him inside. I quickly called for assistance. I stood guard at the door, listening to his screams from the other side. Within minutes, 2 officers ran down the hallway, guns drawn. They reached me, and I unlocked the door, stepping back as they stormed in. I watched as they put him into the police car, his eyes still fixed on me until the very last moment. Back in the security room, I sat down, exhausted but relieved. I scrolled through the camera feeds, carefully checking each one. Then on the feed from the costume shop, I noticed something odd. A new mannequin, dressed in the same outfit, stood in the display window. My heart raced as I leaned closer to the screen. It was just a mannequin, right? As I looked, a shadow moved behind it, just a flicker, barely visible. My hand hovered over the controls, but I shook my head to clear my thoughts. Maybe it was just my imagination playing tricks after a long night, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching, waiting for me out there to confront it. Trucker's secret mission. Another long and quiet night on the highway. The road stretched endlessly before me, illuminated only by the headlights of my truck. I had been driving this road for years, working undercover as a long-haul truck driver. My real job was much more dangerous, tracking criminals, operating on these desolate roads under the cover of darkness. I am an undercover cop. My truck is my weapon, my disguise, and my hideout. Tonight was supposed to be like any other night, but I had a feeling, something gnawing at the back of my mind, telling me that tonight would be different, so I needed to be extra cautious. The road was deserted. The only sounds were my engine and the occasional rustle of wind over the barren landscape. I kept my eyes on the road, scanning the distance for any signs of trouble. Criminals often use these isolated highways to conduct their business, and I've made it my mission to stop them. Suddenly, I spotted a figure standing by the roadside, waving for me to stop. It was late, too late for anyone to be out here. My instincts kicked in immediately. Something was off. I slowed down and stopped by the roadside. The man approached, his face shrouded in darkness. He looked disheveled, almost deranged. As he got closer, I could see his clothes were torn and filthy. His hands twitched nervously at his sides, and there was a wild look in his eyes. I cautiously rolled down my window. "Do you need help?" But there was something about this guy, something dangerous. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he smiled a slow, eerie smile that sent chills down my spine. Then, he pulled something out from under his coat, a small black box. I recognized it immediately. It was a vial containing a dangerous, illegal substance, something that could be lethal on contact. My heart beats fast. This is no ordinary hitchhiker. He is a dangerous man, and his target is me. The man stepped closer, holding the vial in one hand and a small knife in the other. "Get out of the truck," he said, his voice low and threatening, "or I'll make sure you don't make it through the night." I knew what was in that vial. It was a more dangerous weapon than the knife he held. Just one drop could incapacitate me, or worse, kill me. He knew it too. That's why he smiled like that. I kept my cool. My training kicked in. I had dealt with guys like him before, unpredictable and dangerous. But this time was different. He wasn't just a criminal, he was playing a twisted game, and I was his target tonight. I slowly unlocked the door, my mind racing as I tried to think of my next move. The man continued to smile, his eyes gleaming with some sick satisfaction. "Come on," he taunted, waving the knife. "Get out of the truck, Brian." I froze. How did he know my name? I had never met this guy in my life. Yet he knew who I was. He stepped closer, holding up the vial. "You think you're so smart, don't you? Driving around here pretending to be a hero, catching guys like me. I've been watching you for a long time." The truth hit me like a punch. This wasn't random. He had planned this, but maybe he didn't know I was really a cop. I climbed out of the truck, raising my hands to show compliance. My mind raced, searching for an opportunity. The man circled around me, still grinning like a madman. He sneered, starting to pace back and forth, waving the knife and vial as he spoke. His words grew more erratic. He muttered something about me stealing it from him, but I couldn't even remember what it was. I racked my brain, trying to recall him. I had taken down countless criminals in my time. Drug dealers, traffickers, murderers. Any of them could have a grudge. But this guy, his face didn't ring any bells. His eyes burned with hatred as he said, "Now I'm going to ruin your life." He stepped closer, waving the vial in front of me. He whispered, "Just one drop, and it'll all be over." I stood still, watching his every move. He was too close, too confident. He thought he had won, but he was careless, distracted by his own need for revenge. Suddenly, luck was on my side. As he rambled, I noticed a flaw in his plan: the way he loosely held the knife. How distracted he was. He was too immersed in his own twisted game. Luckily, every time I went on a mission, I always wore gloves to protect myself from hazardous materials. Without warning, I lunged forward, knocking the vial from his hand, sending it skidding across the pavement. He was shocked, but not for long. He swung the knife at me, but I was ready because I had been through it and knew how to handle it. I grabbed his wrist and twisted until he dropped the blade. The struggle was quick and brutal. I used every trained skill to subdue him, pinning him to the ground before he could react. He thrashed, cursing and screaming, but it was over. I had him. As I held him down, panting from the exertion, I asked, "Who are you? Why are you doing this?" He just laughed a cold, empty laugh. I stared at him, the pieces falling into place. He was one of the first criminals I had ever apprehended, a drug trafficker. He didn't forget I waited, planned, burned my hatred for years. I squeezed him. His words stabbed deeper than any weapon. He didn't pursue money or drugs or even freedom. He pursues revenge aimlessly and empty. Once he was subdued, I discreetly pressed for backup, making sure no one knew my true identity, while I waited for the other officers to arrive. I couldn't shake the chill down my spine. This man, this forgotten criminal, had built his entire life around destroying me. The lights of the patrol cars approached. This job wasn't just about catching criminals. It was about the shadows that follow you, carrying grudges from the past that never truly go away. My colleagues took him away. For every criminal I took down, there would be another waiting, another with a grudge, another seeing me as the one who ruined their lives. But now I understood more. The real danger wasn't out there on the road. It was in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. Mysterious masked person. The house was peaceful under the moonlight, and it seemed like it would be a simple summer week without my parents. They trusted me to take care of everything, and so far, I had been enjoying video games, staying up late, every kid's dream. Around 11 o'clock p.m., I was lounging on the couch, absorbed in my game. My phone buzzed beside me. A message from an unknown number popped up on the screen. "Hi." I frowned. "Who was this?" I asked, but the reply came instantly, mixed with irritation and aggression. "You don't know who this is?" I tried explaining that I had just gotten a new phone and lost my contacts, but the angry messages kept coming. I assumed it was a prank and put my phone on silent, returning to my game. I wasn't sure how much time had passed, but I was startled by a sound. A knock on the bedroom window. At first, I thought I was imagining it. It was late, and I'd been alone for days. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. Still, I cautiously moved to the window, pulling the curtain aside. Nothing, just an empty yard. But I knew I'd heard something. I pulled out my phone, intending to call my mom, when I noticed several unread messages from the same unknown number. The last one sent chills down my spine. "I'm here." I froze. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat louder than the last. I immediately tried to call my mom, but the screen flashed, no signal. No way. We always had good reception here. I ran to the back porch and listened. Maybe, just maybe, someone was crying for help. I had years of self-defense training, and despite the fear surging through me, I was ready to defend myself. This could be a setup, a trick. I grabbed an old baseball bat from the garage and stepped into the backyard. The night was eerily quiet, which made me even more uneasy. I walked toward the edge of the trees, sweeping through the shadows. I shouted into the night, trying to sound confident, demanding who was there and telling them not to mess with me. Suddenly, a flashlight flickered, shining straight at me from deep in the woods. Whoever was holding it was too far for me to see their face, but they were trying to get my attention. The light went out as quickly as it had come on, and the screaming started again, this time more desperate. I slowly made my way toward the spot where the light had appeared. As I got closer to the trees, my heart pounded louder than my footsteps. The woods were dense, with towering trees casting deep shadows. I knew I shouldn't be doing this, but I couldn't stop. I yelled out, asking where the person was. A voice answered from somewhere ahead, a faint whisper saying,
"Here, help me."
I stepped deeper into the woods. My grip tightened around the bat, and my legs felt heavy as I moved forward. I saw a figure. My voice trembled as I asked if it was the person calling for help. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it started moving. In a split second, I realized this wasn't someone tied up. This was someone alive, and they were running toward me. Panic surged through me, and something inside screamed at me to get away to save my life. I didn't know how, but I ran. I slammed the porch door behind me, locking it, then sprinted to my room, slamming the door shut. The knocking started again, first at the front door, then at the window. It was relentless, as if he was trying to break in from every corner. He wasn't playing anymore. He was hunting me. I heard the sound of glass shattering from the living room. My heart raced as I realized he was inside. Footsteps echoed through the house, slow and deliberate. He was looking for me. I hid behind the bedroom door, gripping the bat. I held on so tightly my knuckles turned white. The footsteps grew closer. I could hear his breathing just outside my door. The door creaked open, and I saw the wolf mask peeking out. He cautiously stepped inside, unaware that I was right behind him. In that split second, I swung the bat as hard as I could. It slammed into his head. He collapsed to the ground, and I didn't stop. I swung over and over until I was sure he wouldn't get up. The house was now quiet after the chaos. Inside, everything was still. The intruder in the wolf mask lay motionless on the floor, while I stood over him, panting, hands shaking as I gripped the bloodied bat. I stared down at the man, his body sprawled across the floor. The wolf mask, now cracked, still covered his head, hiding his face. For a moment, I froze, unable to process what I had just done. My phone still had no signal, but I needed help. I needed to get out of there. I rushed to the landline in the kitchen, my hands trembling uncontrollably as I dialed 911. I struggled to find the words, pressing the phone tightly to my ear, trying to calm down. I glanced back at the hallway leading to my bedroom, terrified that the masked man would get up again. The distant sound of sirens broke the silence of the night. Red and blue lights flickered across the walls as the police car stopped in front of the house. Their grim faces approached the door as I shakily opened it. The officers stepped inside, examining the broken glass, the signs of a struggle, and finally, the man lying on the floor. One officer knelt down, checking for a pulse. He said, "You did the right thing," as if he had seen this horror many times before. They told me to sit down and breathe, but I couldn't focus on anything except that mask, the wolf mask. Why? Why did he choose to wear it? The unconscious man was lifted onto a stretcher. His mask still hadn't been removed. My mind was still reeling from the events that had just unfolded. The next morning, I was at the police station. The officers asked me about the man, whether I had ever seen him before. I shook my head, explaining the messages, the strange knocks, and the wolf mask. Then, they told me his name was Thomas, and he had been on the run for years. A detective handed me a file filled with old newspaper clippings and photographs. The story they told me was chilling. Thomas had a disturbing past. Years ago, he had committed a series of home invasions in nearby towns. He would stalk his victims for days, learning their routines before making his move, and he always wore a mask to cover half his face. But it wasn't just any mask. The wolf mask had become his signature. In every report, survivors described the same thing. A tall man in a wolf mask, terrorizing families, always escaping before the police could catch him, until now. The final piece of the mystery was revealed when the detective, now more familiar with Thomas's case, explained why he chose the wolf mask. The detective slid a newspaper article toward me. It had a blurry photo of the wolf mask next to a headline that read, "Wolf Stalker Evades Capture." The detective said the wolf represented a predator, a cunning hunter. Thomas saw himself as the wolf, and his victims were the prey. It terrified me to think about how long he might have been watching me, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. He had been toying with me, like a wolf plays with its prey. That night, back home, I sat alone in the living room, the faint hum of the TV filling the silence. My parents wouldn't be leaving me alone for a long time after this. The mystery of why he wore the mask had been solved, but the fear of that night still lingered. I didn't know if I would ever feel truly safe again, but one thing I did know, I would never forget the image of that cracked wolf mask lying on the floor. The house of the lost child. It was 2006 when my family moved into this house. My parents decided to quit their jobs and start anew in the countryside. I was just a child then. But something about this house struck me immediately. The first thing I noticed when we moved in was the stairs. Every time I passed by, I would see a shadow silently moving up and down. It never frightened me. In fact, it felt oddly familiar. I was 6 years old, but I could always see things that others couldn't, and this house was no exception. I didn't tell my parents right away, not because I was scared, but because I felt that presence meant us no harm. Still, I was very afraid of the dark. My room was upstairs while the bathroom was downstairs. Every night, before going to bed, I would use the bathroom to avoid facing the fear of going down the stairs alone at night. But one night, my mother's voice woke me. She called out to me, angrily and irritably, telling me to come downstairs and not to run around anymore. I sat up in bed, confused. I hadn't run at all. In the following days, I kept experiencing similar incidents. My mother often scolded me for running around the house, accusing me of mischief. I had told her many times that I hadn't done it, but she never believed me. Then one night, the power went out, and we were almost engulfed in darkness, lit only by a few flickering candles in the living room. As we sat together, I saw it again, a shadow. It swayed back and forth, hovering over the sofa. My mother didn't see it, but I did. That presence was very strong but had no malice. That night, as we lay in bed, my mother and I heard a voice, soft yet clear as day. "Mom, where are you? I'm cold." That voice belonged to a child, and it came from just outside our bedroom. My mother looked at me, eyes wide with fear. As I grew older, I began to understand that the shadow wasn't there to harm us. It wasn't a ghost trying to scare us, but a lost child searching for something. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that spirit was looking for its mother. I had a friend who could sense things like I could, and they suggested that I tell the spirit to move on. So one quiet afternoon, I stood in the living room and said to the air, "I believe your mother loves you very much. You can move on. It's time to go to a happier place." The house felt different afterward. The shadow disappeared. The footsteps stopped. No more voices at night. I thought that the spirit had finally found peace, or perhaps it needed to validate something because it had been left here and unable to move on in this house. In 2018, my aunt, Tita, who had worked abroad, returned home to retire. One evening, we sat together in the living room, sharing stories. We talked about the strange occurrences that had taken place in the house over the years. I told her about that spirit, about how my mother had once mistaken it for me because it looked like a small child. I explained how I had ultimately helped it move on. As I was speaking, I noticed something. Tita, she's crying. She started telling me a story I had never heard before. Long before I was born, my grandmother, she was pregnant with Aunt Tita. Not long after that, there was a baby boy. She named her son Angelo. Suddenly one day, Grandma left and didn't come back. At that time, Aunt and Angelo were too young to know what to do in this remote suburb. So, Angelo lay on the sofa. The boy was sick and passed away in his sleep while clutching a small glass jar that his mother had given him. He was only about 3 to 4 years old. At that time, my aunt was too young to understand what was happening and thought her brother was just sleeping until one day a neighbor came and took the boy to a small coffin and buried him. Our new house sits on this land. Perhaps the boy could not move on because he was waiting and didn't know when his mother would return. Sometime later, my aunt, the boy's sister, passed away just after we talked about him. Now, standing in front of the house, I can't shake the feeling that something has changed. Then came the unmistakable sound of soft footsteps. They echoed from the hallway behind me, moving toward the stairs. I turned around, breath caught in my throat. The shadow had returned. As I climbed the stairs, I saw the shadow standing right above and sliding into my bedroom. Upon reaching the room, I hesitated. My hand hovered over the doorknob, and just as I was about to turn it, I heard, "Mom, where are you?" I slowly pushed the door open, the creaking hinges filling the silent house. The room was bathed in the faint light of the moon filtering through the window, casting a cold glow over everything. My heart skipped a beat as I saw Angelo. This time, he was not just a shadow. He stood in the middle of the room, a small, frail figure, unmistakably a child. His head was bowed down. Then slowly, Angelo lifted his head, and for the first time, I saw his face. A face with deep-set eyes filled with sorrow. His mouth opened, and in a voice that sent chills down my spine, he whispered, "Mom, where is she?" I wanted to tell him, to explain that she had passed away. But before I could say anything, he raised a small glass jar, looking at it as if it held an ominous energy imprisoning his soul. Angelo stood still, clutching the jar, looking at me with hollow eyes. I had to do something. I couldn't let Angelo remain trapped forever. I took a deep breath, my voice trembling as I finally spoke to Angelo, telling him that his mother was no longer here. I told him to always believe that she loved him, so I urged him to move on. For a moment, Angelo's expression softened, but then he tightened his grip on the jar. His voice rang out again, firm and more desperate. "Where is my mom? I want to see her." As if he didn't believe the words I was saying. Tears welled up in my eyes as I realized there were no words that could satisfy him. He wasn't just seeking peace. He wanted his mother, and nothing else mattered more than that. I could feel the air shift, the temperature drop, and for the first time in years, I felt fear. I couldn't let him stay. I had to help him find peace. Without thinking, I stepped toward him, my hands trembling. "Angelo, I can help you find her. But first, you need to let go, to release everything." His gaze shifted from the jar to me, his hollow eyes filled with confusion and longing. Slowly, very slowly, he began to loosen his grip on the jar. As it fell from his hand and shattered on the floor, the room went silent. Angelo's figure began to fade, dissolving into the moonlight. Before he disappeared completely, I heard his voice one last time, soft, almost a whisper. "Thank you." I stood outside the house. The weight that had burdened it for years was gone. Angelo was finally free. The feeling of guilt lingered, but I knew I had finally helped him find the peace he had been searching for all these years. The love his mother had for him, the love that had anchored Angelo to this world, had freed him. Perhaps he was beginning to understand the painful truths that even I never wanted to hear. He would likely continue his journey to find his mother in another world where he truly belonged. I looked back at the house one last time. It no longer felt haunted. Now, it was just a house, quiet and still. Angelo had gone, but he left behind something much more enduring. It was a son's love for his mother, transcending the boundaries of life and death.